Okay, so this is going to be my introductory lecture to the Natural Selection Laboratory. And if there are a couple things that I've learned about this particular lab exercise, that we tend to run out of time. So it's going to be very important that you go through and get the main ideas, go through this video and get the main ideas of what we're going to be covering in this um, exercise. Okay, so here's my introductory video. I want to cover three topics. The first one is the process of natural selection, the mechanism of natural selection, and how it works. That's going to be the main focus for today's lab. And after that, we'll just have a little general context added to the picture. For example, I want to be able to have you have a good idea of what we mean by adaptive evolution and how natural selection, the mechanism of evolutionary change, is really all about understanding why organisms are very well suited to their environment. Adaptation and the direction of evolutionary change is going to be the second topic. And then the third topic that I'll try to fit in at the end is an important one. It's that of common descent, because we make use of this argument many times in the course of a class like BIO100 or pretty much any biology course that you take. So let's jump right in. We'll talk a little bit about phenotypic variation, which is the first important ingredient in order for us to be talking about natural selection. Darwin identified that Darwin first noted that if you look at any natural population, things might appear to you initially to be all pretty uniform. So, for example, if you look at a school of fish or a population of bushes in a field, you might first reach the conclusion that they're all the same, they're all identical, they're all completely uniform. But then if you look more carefully, what you'll find is that there is variation. You might find that there are, for example, variation in the sizes of leaves of the bush plants. So if you look at all the bushes in a field, you might find a few that have smaller leaves than average, a few that have larger leaves than average. And yeah, if you go through every last one of several thousand individual plants, you might find the one tree that has the smallest leaves of them all. And you might similarly find the one tree that's got the biggest leaves of them all. But by far the bulk, the majority of the trees are going to have leaf sizes that are kind of intermediate, your average Joe of leaf size, if you will. And so this is the first concept, the idea that we have phenotypic variation. And one of the ways that we describe the variation of a population is by talking about the frequency distribution of the leaves. So basically, if we went through and counted the number of plants with really, really tiny leaves, there would probably be very few of them. Very few plants with really large leaves, but the majority of the plants would be somewhere in between, and you'd have something like this. You'd have a bell-shaped distribution. This is a very famous concept. The whole thing, we would call that a frequency distribution, because we're talking about the frequency of the different morphs, the plants that have really small leaves have got a very low frequency. Those that have slightly larger leaves have a higher frequency, and this is represented by a higher position in this graph. And this particular kind of frequency distribution that's kind of shaped like a bell is a very famous one. It's called the normal distribution, and we'll be addressing this specifically in our laboratory exercise today. And so the general idea here is that if we have variation in phenotype, by phenotype I mean the actual characteristic that we're measuring, leaf size in this case. We might be talking about flower color or bill length. That's the topic that we'll be discussing in our laboratory. But if we can take any characteristic of an organism called a phenotype, measure them for the population, which you'll probably find is a range of variation from smallest value to largest value, in which the average value will probably be the most common one. And this is our normal or bell-shaped curve. Okay, so that The basic idea of natural selection is that given this phenotypic variation, um, there might be situations where organisms that are either on one end or the other end of the distribution have a higher than normal, higher than average rate of surviving or reproducing or both. And if that's the case, for example, if we had this is our frequency distribution, and these plants way over here on this end had a higher rate of success. They got eaten less by herbivores. They had higher survival rates through periods of drought. They left more seeds compared to these plants out here with the larger leaves. Then what you're going to see is that in over the course of generations, if this were to be continued over a long span of time, what you would see is that these plants with smaller leaves would be leaving more offspring than the larger leaf plants, and over time, the plants would eventually be replaced by plants with smaller and smaller leaves. Okay, and this is how we discuss the process of evolutionary change. Darwin, in fact, your textbook asks you to relate this to artificial selection, which is a really good exercise. We can talk about this in the context of a population of say livestock, and maybe instead of talking about leaf size, we might be talking about the milk yield in cattle. Okay, so instead of big leaves over here, you might have the cattle that have a large number of gallons of milk yielded per week, and on the other end, you would have those cows that are producing a small number of gallons per week. And basically, if you have a huge herd of cattle and you're measuring the milk yield per week of every last cow in your herd, you would again have this frequency distribution with the average milk yield being the most common. Now with artificial selection, what you're probably going to be doing is you'll be you'll be preferentially keeping the offspring of those cows that are having the highest milk yield. And so in other words, we have this process of selection, artificial selection, or maybe only these guys out here, the cows with the 10% of cows with the highest milk yield are going to be the ones that we keep, and their calves will be used to create the next generation of cows. And all these other cows out here, once they're done yielding milk, we would turn them into cheeseburgers. And so the outcome of this would be the next generation of cows would be the offspring of only the 10% of the highest yielding cattle from the previous generation. And in this process, we would have the effect of improving our stock. The next generation of cows would have a kind of a genetic predisposition to have a high milk yield, and therefore we would be getting a larger number of gallons per week from our next set of cows. So that's the way that artificial selection works. It's actually very, very similar to the way that natural selection works. The difference is largely in terms of the intensity of selection. With artificial selection, we could deliberately select only the 10% of the highest yielding cattle. Whereas with natural selection, the differences between who survives and reproduces and who doesn't is generally far more subtle. And we'll be getting to this in our exercise today, or whenever we take the lab. All right, so that's the first concept. This is how selection, either natural selection or artificial selection, is going to cause a change in the characteristics of a population from generation to generation. And this is the mechanism of natural selection, evolution by natural selection. The characteristic of the outcome of this is that the populations in the next generation will be more adapted, will be better suited to their environmental conditions. Now, one of the things that Sel Khan does in his video is to talk about whether or not there's any kind of preordained direction to natural selection. Is there any kind of guiding force that causes populations to evolve in one particular direction or the other? And the answer to that is really no. It's more or less determined generation to generation based on what characteristics are favored by the environment. And yes, some environments may systematically favor plants with smaller leaves. Other environments might systematically favor plants with larger leaves. And if we had a species of plant that was distributed into two different habitats, one that favored smaller leaves and another that favored larger leaves, you could sort of see what's going to happen. Now, as we start off as a single species of plants with a particular leaf size, the plants over on in the first location are going to be evolving toward having smaller and smaller leaves, whereas the plants in the other condition, in the other environment, are going to evolve towards having larger and larger leaves. So this is the way that we kind of project the process of natural selection giving rise to two different kinds of organisms that are descending from a common ancestral species. And here's where we get to the concept of common descent. So I want to give you another example of this here. Let's take two species that you're probably familiar with. Um, let's just go with a mountain lion and a wolf. Okay, so if we just compare the mountain lion and the wolf, you would say here are two species that are really different from each other. They're not really related to each other at all. Okay, and their characteristics are altogether different, and that might seem to be the case in the modern world, and certainly mountain lions and wolves are totally different species. However, if you it's not, you don't have to go back that far in time. We've got a fossil record that is pretty good, and we know that you don't go back that many thousands of years in which the actual animal that we know as a mountain lion did not exist. It was not its own entity as we know it today. In fact, there might have been no difference between mountain lions and other kinds of cats, like a tiger. And in my next version of this, you might say, well, yeah, there would have been cats. There would have been some type of cat-like organism that was neither tiger nor mountain lion. Might have been the ancestor that gave rise along one lineage, along one population, giving rise to the cats that eventually evolved into tigers living in Asia, and the cats that evolved into mountain lions living in North America. And this is the process that we were kind of describing before. From that ancestral cat species, conditions in one lineage gave rise to a pathway, an evolutionary trajectory that led to the evolution of the mountain lion from that ancestral cat, which is very different from the trajectory that led to the tiger. Similarly, on the wolf side, we've got today two different species, wolves and coyotes. And you don't have to go back that far in time to find a time and place where wolves and coyotes were not there yet. There was no wolf distinct from a coyote. There was just some type of ancestral dog-like animal, and that was the animal that eventually evolved in two different directions into the wolf and the coyote. So let's say this might have been 8 million years ago, and the ancestral cat and the ancestral dog were different from each other. But again, you don't have to go back that much further in time, maybe another 40 or 50 million years. This is well documented in the fossil record to find a situation where neither cats nor dogs were distinct as different types of mammals. There might have been a kind of a generic cat-dog ancestor, something that was generically carnivorous, and similarly there, one of the descendant populations from this ancestral carnivorous mammal species became more and more cat-like in its evolutionary trajectory, giving rise to the ancestral cat, and the ancestral cat split off into two different factions, one of which evolved into a tiger, the other one into a mountain lion, and the other lineage of ancestral carnivorous mammals might have given rise to a dog-like ancestor. And this is a gross oversimplification. There are obviously many different kinds of carnivorous animals, including things like bears and weasels and sea lions and that sort of thing. But the general picture is that if you trace back far enough, uh, all living organisms share common ancestry. Um, you don't have to go back that far in time before you get to a general ancestral mammal that gave rise to both tigers and mountain lions and wolves and coyotes. Not only them, but also to rabbits and mice and bats and primates, including humans. And so the idea of common ancestry is really embedded there in the whole fabric of our understanding of evolutionary change. This is important because we talk at length about the similarities between organisms and how we can use the sequence of bases in DNA, the DNA similarities, to establish the relative relationships and uh, relative closeness and distances between species of different types. For example, you could take a tiger and mountain lion and compare their DNA, and what you'll find is a much higher degree of similarity between a tiger and a mountain lion than you would find between a tiger and a wolf. And that's to be expected. This is a prediction that's made by evolutionary theory, which incorporates the concepts of adaptation as well as common descent. So getting back to our original slide, what we're looking at here is basically a depiction of how the processes of natural selection, adaptation, and common ancestry or common descent are intimately related to each other and create a general narrative of life's history. Right? So I hope this gives you a little bit of context for why we study the process of natural selection.